I'm Lau Branson, and this video is going to look at primary frameworks for leadership and illustrate those in a number of ways. And so the focus is going to be how do we work into some of the theological issues we've already raised, and what do those look like when they're engaged, both on how you're changing as a leader as well as in how leaders work at change in organizations. All of this is going to be reflecting back on some theological issues we've already raised. So the leadership practices, characteristics will still be rooted in God is ahead of us with our neighbors and neighborhoods, that God is the primary initiator. And so whatever we're doing as leaders, that's the primary conviction. That's what's behind what we're doing. Also then, as we're engaging people, neighbors, as well as the members of the church, we're engaging them not as objects, not as fragments of some kind of vision, not as strategic, tactical pieces, but they are subjects. They actually have voice, they have agency inside the midst of our work with our role as leaders. The Holy Spirit's missional imagination is among God's people. This isn't something that's delivered by a leader. This isn't something that's delivered and packaged and marketed, but in fact it's inside the people of God. And often while their previous experiences have shaped them, but they're not agents, so they have no agency, the leadership that we're talking about changes that so that they know they're not just there passively, or they're there as a polite opposition or as pieces of a plan, but in fact they're there as agents of the process. And that ecclesiology then is done locally. That while we receive much from tradition and certainly scripture, but our ecclesiology, what it means to be God's people, sign, foretaste, witness of the kingdom of God, that is expressed and engaged locally. And so as we shift the meanings of leadership from command and control, from vision, mission, planning, here's a quote from one of the primary textbooks that Juan and I wrote. Leadership is not about an individual or even a small group having great ideas and pulling a church into their vision. Leadership is about shaping an environment in which the people of God participate in an action-reflection cycle as they gain new capacities to discern what God is doing among and around them. That's the core leadership function. If that's not happening, no matter what's being accomplished in organizational goals and what's described as product, it's not the kind of leadership that we're working on. Earlier on in the term, we looked specifically at 3 lenses to look at leadership, and these have to be working together or you end up with a dysfunctional leadership. That leaders shape a learning community, a community that's constantly interpreting what it's receiving. And so we've received texts from our Christian tradition, Bible tradition, worship, liturgical materials, all of that. Those are the texts that are received. And the interpretive community works with that. The interpretive community also works with the texts of a culture or of a society. And sometimes those are printed texts, but I'm also using the word much more broadly. It's the experiences that we're looking at, the realities on the ground, the stories of the people as God is engaging them. And so an interpretive leadership team shapes the whole interpretive community in the meanings that are needed for practice. So there's real leadership here. There's real guidance in this. And you gain a capacity to see if your work as an interpretive leader is actually doing what it needs, because the competencies of the whole group are increased to be agents in the interpretive task. Relational leadership connects and nourishes connections between the self, church participants, and neighbors, with all of this moving toward love and synergism. It's how do we become subjects in each other's lives, and how do we do that? What's appropriate? What's generative in the way that we do that with God as an active agent? That's everything from how do you create a new relationship, a new synergy? How do you deal with conflict resolution? How do you deal with differences? Because all of those aren't just matters of ideas, but they're matters of real life-on-life relationships. Much of the work we've talked about in boundary crossing between cultures, ethnic groups, classes, generations, all belongs here. That you don't have the choice of saying that we're just going to pocket people out of some sameness, some homogeneity. But in fact, relational leadership means that we're going beyond that. Implemental leadership, you really do need to design operations. Everything from, after a while, deciding what time you're going to start a gathering, or what you're going to print out, or how you're going to set out steps in a particular process. So implemental leadership shapes the organization for experiments, for practices. Those are repeated activities that shape us as we shape them. And it forms the structures so that the gospel is embodied and articulated. And so this is behind every element of what we're doing as we move forward. Just want to look at a couple of quotes from Alan Roxburgh in a book that wasn't one of the assigned texts. It's called Missional Mapmaking. Alan says that when we universalize a method like strategic planning, a method for achieving preset goals and objectives, we essentially turn every variable in the process, including human beings, into objects to be used in the achievement of a goal. There is no way around this. Strategic planning uses objectification to achieve its ends. You can certainly think about times where you have felt objectified, even in the midst of saying, gosh, that'd be kind of a nice thing to pull off. But strategic planning out of modernity, out of scientific management theory, objectifies everything it touches. That doesn't mean that there shouldn't be missional planning of types. So there shouldn't be time. We do have to actually lay out some steps and figure out participation in those steps. But it's very different than this kind of comprehensive scientific management theory tactical approach. In that same book, this is the quote that I put on the back and may entice some of you to read the whole book. What if a leader, contra modern expectations, is not to provide dependable predictions, vision, answers, strategic plans, and operational control? Rockford claims these modern ways, based on outdated maps, blind us to reality, stifle churches, and result in misguided efforts, deepening disappointment and fatigue. Instead, leaders are to be cartographers in a new terrain, shaping churches in which map makers multiply, as God is encountered in biblical texts and in local context. That's the kind of leadership that we're after. We're going to look particularly now at the difference between technical challenges that you face in yourself and in your organization and adaptive challenges. There's some articles coming up by Ron Heifetz, as well as Chapter 10 of Branson Martinez, where you'll be getting more information on this. But it's important to have this framework simply as a way to engage the next steps in our leadership discussion. So a technical challenge in an organization has clear goals. You can name the goal. Here you see a man walking, and it's pretty obvious what the goal is. There's a town out ahead, seems to have a center to it, and so even just intuitively you can say that you can see the goal, that it can be named, it can be clarified. So inside technical challenges then, as you're providing technical leadership, you clarify the goal, you work with the group to name the methods that are possible for getting there, because everybody knows those methods. You're working with current knowledge. You may have to add on some new information. You may have to gain some specific information, but overall you have the knowledge necessary to do that work. There are available resources. It may not be easy to come up with the resources, but they're available. There's familiar roles and adequate competencies. It doesn't mean that there isn't new training that has to go on. Usually there is some kind of additional training and some adapting of roles, but still it's within our normal imagination. It's within our normal ways of doing business. Predictable and manageable change. It's all within the competencies of the group. And we are who or what we need to be. We're the right people to do this because we already have these capacities to see, to act, to collaborate, to achieve. So look at this next picture. And the question is, where's he going? Or how's he going to get there? Or what does he need to get there? And this is why adaptive change is a very, very different kind of leadership. I need to say you need to be good at technical challenges in order to be able to do adaptive challenges. When you can name goals and do all the things of the previous slide, that's critical. You've got to be able to have good competencies for that. But an adaptive challenge is one where the future is murky. You really cannot name the goal. You could name one, but that would be misleading. It would, in fact, obviate the real challenge. So you can't name the goal. It's murky. You don't know the road to the goal. There's new learning, but it isn't just kind of an add-on, get some more data. It's actually learning new processes, learning whole new ways to perceive that are not currently part of the way the organization is working. The resources aren't identified, so you don't know what you need, and so you certainly don't know where you're going to get them. There's unfamiliar roles. This is not in anybody's comfort zone. So there's unfamiliar roles and competencies. It's all unpredictable. The change is uncontrollable. You're not in a predict, manage, control mode. And we're not the people we need to be to do this. This is one of the most difficult parts of this, is if you're convinced we've got what we need, then it's a technical challenge or you've mislabeled it. Ron Heifetz says that the first job of a leader is to identify the adaptive challenge. Can you name, here's the technical parts of what we're facing, but here are the adaptive parts of what we're facing. And I also want to then say, back to one of the issues that many of you dealt with in your essay, a starting point for dealing with adaptive challenges is being able to know those that are about you. That these aren't just about the organization you're working in, which certainly would be adaptive challenges there. But what are the adaptive challenges about your own leadership? This is not just needing to acquire a few new skills. This is saying, I'm really clueless here. I really don't know what I need to be. I don't know what I need to do. I don't know where to start. I don't know where I'm heading. So is there an element of your current work? Is there an element of the responsibilities you have that even while you plod and work at it and name a goal and repeatedly are able to actually in that situation be able to see that you aren't naming the right goal, or you fail in getting there? Those are the kind of situations that are adaptive. It's coming in a new situation or a new situation confronting you. You look at the organization and you think, I really don't know how to do this, and I'm not even sure what this is anymore. So naming your personal adaptive challenges are critical, or you're not going to have the clear sight to be able to see the adaptive challenges in the organization. This material all comes, like I say, from Ron Heifetz, some in a book he also co-authored with Marty Linsky. And this is what they work at, is saying, here are the tasks you have if you're leading an adaptive challenge. First of all is get on the balcony. By that they mean, they're talking about a dance floor. And you need to get on the balcony so that you can look down at the dance floor. And as you do that, you can see movement. You can see who is connecting with whom. You can pick up the rhythm and the directions of everything. And that's what you need to be able to do in adaptive situation, adaptive challenge. You've got to be able to get some distance and identify what's going on. There's even two other steps of this first one that are a little bit more difficult. You need to be able to step up on the balcony while you're in the midst of the work. So you're in the middle of a meeting, you're in the middle of some discussion, you're in the middle of some activities. And you actually, while in the midst of it, you step onto the balcony and you even see yourself down there and you see, here's what happens when I walk in the room. Here's what happens when this other person said this. Here's what happened when I said this. And you're observing this from the balcony while you're actually engaged in the situation. Not only that, but if we're talking about team leadership, you actually need to be able to do that with your team. And so the conversation becomes one of perceiving, observing, attempting to name, nuancing the naming. All of that's an imaginative work right in the middle of the situation. And so as you get on the balcony then, the hard work, the first work is to discern the adaptive challenge. That doesn't mean name the new goal more accurately. It's saying, I think what's going on here is we're real clueless on the generational issue. We can do lots of planning and have lots of activities and get volunteers, but we really don't know what we're doing on the generational life of our church and our neighborhood. And so you can name a theme, an area that is the adaptive challenge without saying, what we need to do is we just need a better youth program, or we need to have more adults talking with youth. Those are all positivist, technical changes. And so it's really an adaptive challenge when you're in this situation where you can name a theme, but you can't name goals or who you need to be yet. Now, managing the holding environment is a much more complex theme, but it is saying that you need to create an environment as a leader among the participants that is safe enough for the participants to speak and to experiment, but also volatile enough, unsure enough, pressured enough to where nobody's going to sit where they are. So they're aware that they can't stay the same. So holding environment makes it obvious you can't stay the same. There's too much pressure here, while making it safe for voice and for experiments. That's what a learning community is in the fullest sense. That's how you create this space as a leader where everyone is on a learning trajectory. And so that's why the next point, you regulate the stress, both for yourself, but also for those you're working with. You're probably aware that if the pressure goes up too much, people shut down. The anxiety level means that you retreat into yourself. You try to cut out all the pressures. This is much of what goes on in an anxious country as we have now. It's when immigration things are happening. It's when economic things are happening, when certain societal capacities are breaking down, that people get anxious and retreat into themselves, retreat into the familiar, retreat into people like themselves. Churches do this. They'll turn in thinking that's where there's safety. And so when the pressure's too high, learning shuts down. So can you create a situation that can lower the pressure in some ways by the way you name the theme, by the way you set up the environment, by the way you deal with your own stresses, by the way you deal with your own adaptive challenges? Now, I'm not wanting to take the route that may be common in pastoral conversations about how you become the non-anxious presence. I actually think there are times of advantages when a people sees the anxiety of their leader. A leader who can say, I'm clueless right now, and this is important. And it's really, I don't want to stay clueless in this, but right now that's where I am. And so it is actually helpful to be able to be anxious in a good sense of the word, pressured, unsure, but know that this is important. And so the regulating stress levels is both at times bringing the pressure down sometimes, but also knowing when to raise it. And that's hard work, and it needs to be done tentatively. And what you'll notice as you do it is different people in the room act differently. So there's not one way to do this that makes it work for everybody. That's why this kind of leadership is so incredibly difficult, is you're creating an environment in which this holding community, this learning, this naming and taking new steps becomes possible. So while you create that homing environment and regulate the stress, then you focus attention on what is the adaptive theme, the adaptive challenge, so that you start creating the conversations around that. And that deepens the conversations, the capacities of the conversation. This is where things like the PT cycle becomes helpful, because it kind of says, are you working with each of these elements, each of these steps as you do this work? You need to give the work back to the people. This is not the job of a person with a title or a role. That the best of learning environments, learning community, dealing with adaptive challenge says, this isn't what you hired me for. This is our work together. And so the way you give the work to the people is you help them own it. You help them see this is what they've signed up for. This is what it means to be this particular people, this learning community. And as you do that, special attention to protecting leadership voices from below, because often God is at work in ways that we're not expecting. The voices that actually start pointing to the road often aren't from their usual places. And so all of these different tasks then become incredibly important for a leader who's going to be working on adaptive challenges. Here, in addition to the PT cycle, I want to provide again these steps of the missional change process. These were in Chapter 2 of Starting Missional Churches. They provide a way for you to see, are we moving through the necessary awareness and conversation so that we can move through an adaptive challenge? So awareness becomes the first thing. When you become aware that some area of your church's life, with neighbors, with generations, dealing with race, dealing with the differences in the room, that awareness starts to arise, you start hearing about it, you sense it yourself, you test it, conversations continue to test it, to see, what is it that we're starting to perceive? What is God prodding us with? And that awareness then slowly moves from that kind of ambiguous, generic theme to an understanding. Here's what we really just do not know what we're doing. Here's where everything that we're doing fails. This is where we're finding out something about our understandings of church and gospel just is not jiving. And so the understanding is where you start getting a little bit more clarity around what is the theme, what is the challenge. And so let's say it has to do with young adults in the church or youth in the church. Then the next step then becomes evaluation. It's where you can say more, if we're going to be the kind of church that we think God's calling us to be in this context, with these people, with these porous borders, with the gifts in the room, with the challenges in the room, here's what really isn't quite working. That if we look at the context, we look at the biblical text, we look at ourselves and we hear stories, then our evaluation is we're missing the mark here. We've got some hard work to do, and we need to figure out some new ways of life together, life with neighbors. And that's then what leads to experiments. We're going to try X. We're going to do some dinners in seniors' homes and get stories from them. We're going to do something else in the way that we arrange segmenting age groups or pulling age groups together. As you saw in video of the Oakland church, how we'd experimented our way toward different ways of cross-generational life in a worship service, or how the church in El Paso started experimenting its way as it saw something that they knew God was pushing them on, and they had to figure out as they went, step at a time. There was no road toward some way of new life. And those are the experiments. And sometimes then an experiment becomes an obvious way that the Spirit of God is engaging you, and a commitment simply means that it's a longer experiment. It still may only be 6 months or a year, maybe longer. And so the commitment means that we're actually engaging this in a longer pattern. Another way to look at this, though, is to realize this is not a straight stair step, that it's much more like zigzagging in a sailboat, tacking across a lake. And it's the same steps there, but be aware that this is not a straight line. It's not the same way we understand tactics in a strategic plan. And as you do it again, we're going to constantly have to come back to the leadership triad. No step can leave out any element of the triad. Every step is interpretive and relational and implemental. And so as a leader, you need to keep checking yourself on this. Am I ignoring some relationships? Am I missing some pain? Am I missing some love, some synergism? Am I missing something that would make a team work better? And what's going on in my own relationships? Am I doing blame or avoidance in the midst of all of this? And implemental work. Are these really the best ways to lay out some particular steps? Are there other things we should be trying? Who here might have some other ideas? And so the triad of leadership is a constant lens as you work through the steps of adaptive challenges. And so those are the basic frameworks going forward. If you think back on the Oakland article and worship service, what do you see along this line? What was adaptive? What processes moved the church in certain directions? The same thing with the El Paso thing. What processes moved them on the adaptive challenges that they faced, that they were kind of clueless to engage? That's the kind of leadership we want to work with. Because if we're saying that the primary work of leaders is to create an environment that participates in God's initiatives, and that God is the primary initiator, all of these elements are going to be constant. That while we're doing the technical work on the things that are fairly clear right now, and within our capacities, and they're who we are, we're also then gaining the capacity to work with the adaptive challenges where we're fairly clueless. Misnaming those is part of what becomes a problem, because think for just a moment, if something is technical and you claim it's adaptive, you're going to wear folks out because you're making it far more complicated than it really is. If it's adaptive and you're naming it technical, you're just going to be wearing people out also, because you're going to constantly be failing, or you're going to be not careful in labeling what is in fact fruitful or successful, because there's kind of a covering that goes on. And so naming which is which and then figuring out steps forward is absolutely critical. And that's why this is a much more difficult way to understand leadership. It's a different set of skills, practices that we need to develop. So that lays it out. There'll be some more videos with more stories that work with this material as we move into the week. God bless you as you engage this. Continue with the reading and the exercises with your Blue Jeans groups and dialogues, and we'll see how it sorts out and where we then need to engage further in the complexity of these.